Good evening. I'm Bernard Schwartz, the director of the 92nd Streetwise Unterberg Poetry Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's reading by Michael Chabon. After the reading, Michael and I will have a short conversation followed by audience questions. After the Q&A, we invite everyone to join us for a book signing in the lounge located through the doors at the back of the hall. Copies of Pops, Michael's new collection of essays, plus his novels, will be available for purchase at that time, courtesy of Postman Books. Before we begin, a reminder that our season finale will take place on Wednesday, June 6th, when Roxane Gay and Tayari Jones will read from their work. Plans for the Poetry Center's upcoming 80th anniversary season are well underway, and we look forward to sharing the full lineup later in the summer. Michael Chabon first appeared here at the Y in May of 1994, reading with Max Apple and Cynthia Ozick to mark the publication of the anthology Writing Our Way Home, a collection of contemporary American Jewish writing. Of the collection's contributors, which included Saul Bellow, Philip Roth, and Grace Paley, Michael's biographical note stands out for its final sentence. Chabon's maternal grandfather's grandfather was the chief rabbi of Vilna, and his father's first cousin was the great journalist Abraham Kahn. Other contributors list their bibliographies, teaching appointments, and awards won, but none traces their roots back even a single generation, let alone to the pious genius of 18th century Vilnius or to the founder of the Forward newspaper. I was always interested in myself, but I never thought I went back that far, as the first line of The Eighth Day, the story Max Apple read that night in 1994. Michael followed Apple to the lectern, reading from the story S. Angel, which opens, "On the morning of his cousin's wedding, Ira performed his toilet, as he always did, with patience, hope, and ruthless punctilio. He put on his Italian wool trousers, his silk shirt, his pink socks, to which he imputed a certain sexual felicity, and a slightly worn but still serviceable Willie Smith sport jacket. Ira never went anywhere without expecting that when he arrived, he would meet the woman with whom he had been destined to fall in love." 2 decades on, and the biographical note at the back of Moonglow, Michael's latest best-selling novel, pays tribute not only to a loving wife, but to the inspiration, understanding, and blessed distraction provided by their 4 children. Now in his new essay collection, Pops, whether tailing his son to Paris for Fashion Week or remembering house calls with his doctor father, Michael captures with characteristic goodness and good faith the complicated time-bending pleasures of being both parent and child, of being understanding and misunderstood, of finding meaning beyond memory and discovery in divergence. A memorable piece on Little League and filial disillusionment ends happily with his 12-year-old daughter curled up next to him on the couch watching baseball on TV. Quote, "She asked a lot of questions. What is a no-hitter, a shutout, a perfect game? It wasn't the first time my daughter had watched a game with me, far from it, but it was the first time she seemed to understand enough to know that she didn't understand. And that, of course, is the beginning of wisdom." Please join me in welcoming Michael Chabon.
Hello, thank you. I'd like to say thank you to the Unterberg Center. I always love coming here. Thanks to Bernard, and thanks to all of you for coming out tonight to hear me. I'm going to read the title essay from this new collection, which is called Pops. "You want to be a doctor too?" the patient asks me, pushing up his left shirt sleeve the way my father has instructed him to do. He's an older man with jowls and a silvery crew cut, wearing a short-sleeved shirt and a necktie, and pinned to a kitchen chair by the boulder of his abdomen. The tap drips water into a cup in the kitchen sink. The smell of the patient's dinner lingers, raw meat and fat against cast iron. When I don't immediately reply to his question, the patient looks up at my father, who has come to the patient's home this evening to conduct an insurance physical. My father reaches into his black bag for his sphygmomanometer, unrolls the cuff, and uncoils the rubber tubing. Like many young doctors, not long out of medical school, he supplements his income during doing these in-home exams. After putting in a full day as a pediatrician at the Phoenix Indian Hospital, where he has been posted by the U.S. Public Health Service, he comes home just long enough to shower and shave for the second time that day, change his shirt and tie, grab a quick bite. Then he heads back out to perform one or more exams for one of the big insurance companies, often taking me with him. Sometimes, as has happened earlier tonight, we forego dinner at home and stop at a favorite restaurant, a Mexican place called Ricardo's. "Cute little guy," the patient says to my father in a confidential tone, then calls to me, parked in a corner on another kitchen chair. "You want to be a doctor, eh? Just like your daddy?" Trying again. Maybe I didn't hear him the first time. I take my sphygmomanometer out of my black bag. Unlike my father's, with its rubberized canvas cuff, sturdy squeeze bulb, and steel and glass gauge, mine is made entirely of brightly colored thin plastic. Like my tailor hammer, my otoscope, my syringe, and the stethoscope that I wear dangling like a pendant necklace the way my father does, with the earpieces pincering my neck. My black bag is plastic, too. A flimsy, lightweight affair with none of the pachyderm heft and dignity of my father's. The mouth of my father's bag opens and closes smoothly on the hinges of a secret armature, clasped by a heavy brass tongue that slides home with a satisfying click. Mine pops open when you flip a plastic tab that has begun to shear loose and will soon snap off. A vial of candy pills was the sole advantage my black bag possessed over my father's, but I have long since prescribed and administered them to myself. The empty vial rolls around at the bottom of the bag. I hunch my shoulders, racked with the dreadful hope that the patient might be about to invite me to come over and check his blood pressure. I squeeze the bulb of my gimcrack instrument. I don't feel that the word cute suits either me or the gravity of the situation. On my previous outings, a few of the patients have allowed me to pretend to stick them with my needleless needle and to hear their hearts beat through my sham stethoscope. There is nothing I want more than for my presence to be taken seriously, and nothing guaranteed to render me more painfully aware of my fraudulence. The truth is, I don't especially want to be a doctor when I grow up. Or rather, I've come to understand that while my presence at these house calls may be cute or amusing, it is in no way promising. I know I am not really cut out for the job. Based partly on direct observation and partly on his tales of his own medical prowess, I have already formed the impression that my father is an excellent doctor. Though he will in other ways disappoint, disillusion, or unfavorably surprise me over the coming decades, this impression will stand. In his hospital tales, my father stars as a first-rate diagnostician with near Holmesian powers to infer rare or easily missed pathologies from the slightest of symptoms. As a small boy, I have no way and no desire to disprove these claims. I have to take his word for them. There's a footnote to that. Though I had observed that whenever a patient on a TV show like Marcus Welby, MD, or Ben Casey presented with odd symptoms, my father always made what proved to be the correct diagnosis long before the first commercial break. But I've been an eyewitness to a number of displays of my father's other remarkable skill as a doctor, one that mysteriously is never the focus of his storytelling. An uncommon gift for reassurance, for making his patients feel that he registers and sympathizes with their pain or discomfort and their anxieties about treatment itself, that he is really listening to them, really seeing them. Later in life, I will encounter and come to understand other self-centered people, capable of great feats of empathy only within certain narrow yet powerful contexts, while writing novels, say. But for the moment, I cling to the misguided hope that the ray of his compassionate attention will one day be directed toward me. And there's a footnote to that. Unless I was gravely ill or seriously injured, and I was almost never either of those things, I didn't even rate the bedside manner. My father's response when I cut a finger, stubbed a toe, twisted an ankle, or fell off my bicycle never varied. We'll have to amputate. When a suture or two was probably called for, he made do with butterflying a pair of Band-Aids. When I fell off a stair railing and broke my arm, he set it with an ace bandage and a flat plastic tool for scraping the ice off our windshield. Both his bedside manner and his diagnostic chops depend, however, on my father's fundamental superpower, which is that, as far as I can tell, he knows everything. His memory is profound, his command of facts sweeping and indiscriminate. He knows the genealogies of English kings, the birth names of all 5 Marx brothers, the Kerschel numbers of the major works of Mozart, the batting averages of the top 10 all-time hitters in both leagues, the differing effects on Superman of the various colors of kryptonite. He has read every important book, seen every classic film, listened to every great symphony. When we listen to classical music in the car, he whistles ostentatiously along with even the most complex and atonal themes. He remembers people's names, details, and particulars. When examining an anxious young patient, he is able to call not simply on large swaths of medical knowledge, but on a disarming command of pop cultural information that helps put both children and their parents at ease. He knows the name of Underdog's arch enemy, Simon Bar Sinister, and of Barbie's little sister, Skipper. He keeps up with the intricacies of daytime soap operas and baseball box scores. There is really no point, I have already decided, in even trying to pass myself off as a doctor, a would-be doctor, or a pint-sized future version of my father. No matter how hard I try, and this is an assessment my father seems to share, I will never know as much as he does, or be as intelligent as he is. "You're a very smart boy," he has informed me a few times now, after I come out with some unexpected fact or precocious bit of perception. "Of course, you'll never be as smart as me," he always adds, smiling in a way that seems apologetic and mocking at the same time. "Following in your footsteps," the patient says, trying my father again, talking a lot, nervous perhaps. At first, my father doesn't answer. When I'm older, he will explain that he used to bring me along with him because the presence of a small child was an icebreaker for anxious patients in a potentially awkward social situation, but in hindsight, this strikes me as improbable. It strikes me now that he may simply have wanted my company or felt guilty about working evenings after having spent his whole day in the company of other people's children. Or maybe he just liked to show me off or show off to me. He had schooled me, for example, to name the presidents in order from Washington through to LBJ. Often during the house calls, he would call on me at some point to perform this or one of the other circus acts of memory, U.S. state capitals, Canadian provincial capitals, in which he found me a willing pony. These may not have broken any ice, but they unquestionably reflected well on his own abilities, both as a rememberer himself and as a skilled trainer of children. "Like father, like son," the patient adds helpfully. My father has fitted the earpieces of his stethoscope to his ears. He slides its diaphragm under the blood pressure cuff. One eyebrow arched, he listens to the patient's pulse with an expression of calm intensity that to this day remains the badge in my imagination of an engaged and curious mind. A few years later, I will watch Leonard Nimoy as Mr. Spock look up from his scanner on the bridge of the USS Enterprise and catch the echo of my father's face. I don't know about that, my father replies, finally, uncuffing the patient's forearm. He might be a little too squeamish. This is a new word to me, but I grasp its meaning immediately. Doctors stick people with needles, cut them open, take their blood, lay bare their bones and organs. Inevitably, doctors, even doctors with gentle and reassuring manners like my father, inflict pain. Is that right? The patient looks at me. In my recollection of this night, I see from his expression that I have disappointed him or let him down, but maybe what I saw on the patient's face was only bafflement. If I didn't want to grow up to be a doctor, then why was I in the man's kitchen at 7 o'clock on a weeknight with a doctor's bag? So what do you want to be? I think back to the subject of conversation between my father and me in our booth at Ricardo's earlier this evening. Ricardo's is the only Mexican restaurant I have ever been to at this point in my life, Mexican restaurants being nowhere as commonplace then as now. And so I have no point of comparison, but decades later, living in California, I will come to understand that Ricardo's was a Mexican restaurant of the old school. Half elegant, red naugahyde and dark wood trimmed in wrought iron, a throwback even then to an era when white people still thought of Mexico as an exotic land inhabited by cacti, burros, men in sombreros, and Lupe Velez. For my father, a Brooklyn boy, there was still something exotic in 1967 about tacos and tamales. To me, there was a solemnity in the iron and wood interior, the chill air, the shadowed booths. Meals there took on an adult air of significance. At the front of the restaurant, the cashier sat behind an old-school glass display case, well stocked with candy, gum, cigarettes, and especially cigars, laid out in their ornate and colorful boxes that depicted great generals and queens, gods of ancient Egypt, Indians in full regalia. Over our dinner tonight, my father remarked that when he was a boy, almost every decent restaurant had featured a cabinet of wonders of this kind. Now, almost none of them did. This observation prompted me to ask him other questions about the world of his boyhood long ago. He told me about the elevated trains of Brooklyn, about the all-day programs at his local movie theater, a newsreel, a cartoon, a serial, a comedy short, the B picture, and finally the A picture, all for a dime. He talked about comic books, radio dramas, Astounding Magazine, and the stories they had told, rocket-powered heroes, bug-eyed monsters, mad scientists bent on using science to rule the world. He described to me how he had saved box tops from cold cereals like Post Toasties and redeemed them by mail for junior G-Man badges or cardboard flying fortresses that carried payloads of black marbles. He told me about playing games like Potsy, stickball, handball, Ringalivio, and for the first but by no means the last time, about an enchanted pastry called a Charlotte Russe, a rosette of whipped cream on a disc of sponge cake served in a scalloped paper cup topped with a maraschino cherry. He described having spent weeks in the cellar of his Flatbush apartment building as a young teenager, trying and failing with some mail-order chemicals, 5 pounds of kosher salt, and a lantern battery to recreate, quote, the original recipe for life on Earth, close quote, as given in the pages of Astounding. In the air-conditioned red darkness of Ricardo's across from the cigar case, the past and the future became alloyed in my imagination. Magic and science, heroes and villains, brick and steel Brooklyn and the chromium world of tomorrow. My father, an inveterate list maker, rattled off the names of games, trains, and radio shows, stopping to give little in the way of description, yet it all came to life for me, as gaudy and vivid and fragrant as those boxes of cigars. Beyond the minimal contours that my father hastily sketched, we had a patient to get to. some quirk in me, in the wiring of my brain or the capability of my heart, enabled me to ride the bare rails of his memory into the past. In my head, in what I was just coming to understand without even putting a name to it as my imagination, I felt that I was or had been present on Flatbush Avenue at the passing of his vivid, vanished childhood. I did not know how I was managing the trick or what it might be good for. I was not even necessarily aware that I was doing it. But I knew immediately that it was my secret superpower. Fair enough. So what do I want to be? How to answer the patient who's now taking long, slow breaths in through the nose, out through the mouth, as the drum of the stethoscope makes checkered moves across his back. I put away the plastic sphygmomanometer and snapped the flimsy clasp of my counterfeit black bag. Let my father be the doctor. When I grow up, I want to tell the patient, I will become a guy who gets to live inside and outside of his own mind and body at the same time, traveling without moving into other worlds, other places, other lives. But I don't know quite how to put it, or exactly what kind of work the proper deployment of my superpower might suit me for or entail. I'm probably going to be a mad scientist, I announced to the patient, to my father, and a little wonderingly, to myself, and make the original recipe for creating life on Earth. 50 years on, though my father has long since retired from regular practice, both as a doctor and as a father, I'm still chasing after that recipe for life, and still 4 times a father myself, doing part-time work as a son. At this point, to be honest, being my father's son is less than a sideline. It's more like a hobby, one of a number of pastimes acquired early, pursued with intensity, laid aside, and then only intermittently over the years resumed. Origami, cartooning, model building, being a baseball fan, being a son. I think of my father at least once every day, try but fail to call him once a week, and as required, afford regular access to his grandchildren. Beyond that, the contours of the job turn vague and history haunted. Outside the safe zone of our telephone calls, with their set menu of capsule film and book reviews, amateur political punditry, and 2-line status reports on the other members of our respective households, the territory of our father and sonhood is shadowed by the usual anger, disappointment, and failure, strewn with the bones of old promises and lies. Strange how a relationship, the relationship that I understand as truly primal, as foundational for good and ill to the construction of myself, my worldview, my art, and my approach to being a father, should for decades now have consisted in and subsisted on a studied avoidance of any but the most ancillary and weightless interactions. And yet, it's in my capacity as his son that I board a flight from Oakland to Portland, Oregon, home to my father for the past 7 years, traveling on a full-fare last-minute ticket, hoping that he's still alive when I get there. The day before yesterday, my father fell so ill so suddenly that he consented, for the first time that anyone can remember, to being hospitalized. A hospital, he always says, is the worst place to be sick. He's home again for now, but I've been given reason to believe that if I want to see him again, and of course at the moment seeing him is all I want to do, I'd better not hesitate. When the plane lands, I take my phone out of airplane mode with a sense of dread and dramatic irony, but there's no fatal text message. I rush over from PDX to the apartment downtown, messaging with my stepmother and my half-brother all the way. When I called to say that I'd be flying up to see him, my father made the expected but unexpectedly feeble attempt to dismiss my urgency as baseless and my visit as gratuitous. But as soon as I walk into the bedroom, I can tell he is happy to have me there. Although he seems to be out of danger for the time being and will make a decent recovery, he freely acknowledges that he just came very near to death. The day before yesterday was bad, he admits. According to your stepmother, I was raving, saying a lot of things that didn't make sense. How could she tell the difference, I say. That's exactly what I said. I lie down beside him on my stepmother's side of the king-size bed. The flat-screen television mounted on the opposite wall is tuned to TCM, which happens to be showing a film I first saw with my father when I was 11 or 12, Fritz Lang's Metropolis. Every few minutes, my father is racked by spasms of gnarly-sounding coughing that have left his voice a ragged whisper. If he taxes it beyond speaking a sentence or two, whatever he says dissolves into a fit of hacking and gasping for breath. It seems best, therefore, to avoid conversation entirely. We lie there for a long time, contemplating Lang's quaint dystopia as it silently unravels. In the 54 years of our mutual acquaintance, I cannot remember our ever having maintained so prolonged a silence in each other's company. It turns out to be not the worst way to spend an hour of your life. But after a while, I find myself thinking about the conversation we aren't having. I start having it with him in my head. This is a great film, but M is the masterpiece. I just saw it again. Incredible, but what about Dr. Mabuse? That's a great film too, but I think you have to give it to M. Have you ever seen Hangmen Also Die? A long time ago. I never really cared for the Hollywood films. You know, she was a Nazi. Thea von Harbu? Yeah. Von Harbu, screenwriter for Metropolis, was married to Fritz Lang from 1922 to 1933. Lang's mother was Jewish. His wife was a member of the Nazi Party. Hey, that would make a great sitcom, I say. The cadence, the tenor, the content of the conversation are also readily accessible to my mind's ear, that they come unbidden, as clearly and freely as if we're speaking the words aloud. I wonder how long it has been since the last time we did this. Just lie around in the middle of the afternoon watching a great movie together. I decide that the answer's probably something in the neighborhood of 40 years. And then, equally unbidden, comes the thought, this is how it will be when he is gone. I will be lying on a bed somewhere, watching Citizen Kane, or A Night at the Opera, or The Man with the X-Ray Eyes, or some other film that became beloved to me through my father's own loving intervention. And even though he won't be there anymore, I will still be watching it with him. I will hear his voice then, the way I am hearing it now, in my head, that instrument set up and tuned to his signal long ago, angled to catch the flow of my father's information, his opinions, all the million great and minor things he knows. After he's gone into that all too imaginable darkness, soon enough now, I will have found another purpose for the superpower that my father discovered in me one evening half a century ago, riding the solitary rails of my imagination into our mutual story, into the future we envisioned and the history we actually accumulated, into the vanished world that once included him. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
You're welcome. Congratulations on your a new arrival. You have a little baby.
Thank you. Thank you.
You a little sleepy?
A little sleepy. Yeah, gotta get home to Tucker, and I have a 3-month-old at home. And
It's all downhill from here, just telling you now.
Enjoy
it while it lasts.
I was hoping when we booked this event with Michael a few months ago and my wife was still expectant that this could turn into some public-private crash course.
Yes,
in
I'm happy.
daddom.
Tell me what I can do. Let me know.
That piece, Pops, is a beautiful tribute to your dad. I'm also the son of a physician, and
did he have a similar sort of callousness toward your injuries and illnesses when you were a kid?
Not so much that, but the selective empathy that could kind of, in sort of specific and self-contained moments, shine on patients as opposed to. But whatever difficult relationship that you would have had with your dad and I have with mine, the idea that a person would come up to you someday and say, like, your father was responsible for saving my life, puts the relationship, if there was a balance, all kind of out of whack.
Depending on who that person whose life was saved is,
Yes.
of course.
But if it happens multiple times, for starters, and just to orient us, because this is a collection of pieces about the territory, as you say, of father and sonhood. That piece ran in the New Yorker just this past winter, I believe.
A couple months back, yeah.
Was that something that you'd been thinking about writing? I know sometimes at a magazine like the New Yorker, the editors know what's going on in your life and they say, why don't you write something?
No, not at all. I just, I was looking for something to write to sort of round this book out that was be somehow, all the other pieces, I'm the father in the piece, and I thought, I wanted to do something in which I was the son and writing about my father, and it just emerged once I sat down. I actually had tried to do that a couple of different ways, and I had actually tried to work on another piece that never went anywhere, and then one day I was like, I just sat down and I guess I started thinking about those trips, the visits I used to make, the house calls with him, and that just was immediately, as soon as I remembered those, I just had a way into the piece right away. And I have something, at this point I've written enough and I've mined my own history and my own experience so much in so many ways for fiction and nonfiction, but I had never written about that, like the house calls and my little doctor bag and my dad being a doctor. And so as soon as I lighted on that, I was like, oh, there's something in that I don't know what it is yet, but I'll get there.
I don't think you say in the piece, how old were you when you had the start of it?
That was 3. I was between 3 and 4 when we lived in Phoenix, Arizona.
Did those visits continue for years?
No, I think then we moved here to Flushing. We lived in Flushing. My dad was a resident, or had some kind of a residency at Albert Einstein Hospital, and I think he was very busy after that and didn't have time, and maybe he was finally starting to make a little money too, so he didn't have time. He didn't seem to pursue those after that.
Part of the reason I ask what your age was, it's clear that you're very young, is the piece, as you were hoping, certainly provides this kind of suitable bookend to the piece, now famous and very popular piece about your son Abe and tailing him to Fashion Week in Paris. And that piece ends with sort of you observing that he's found his people. And at that point he's 13 and you say, you were early. The boy in Pops, though the beneficiary of any number of loving interventions on the part of his father, seems to have traveled a much longer, more twisted path. I mean, Abe's story isn't written yet, obviously.
No, it could all change.
But there is a happiness to the end of the piece on your son that I think is all the more gratifying when we reflect as readers on maybe the difficulties that you had with your own dad.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure there's a question in here somewhere, which is just that this book covers a lot of ground, you being, moving between the role of father's son
Mm-hmm.
and son's father,
Mm-hmm.
although there is some about your daughters as well.
Yes,
And I'm curious to know, do you approach writing about your kids or your experiences of your kids in similar ways to your dad, your parents, things that have happened in the past?
Well, I mean, I think I tend to write pieces like this, essays, in an effort, as the name essay suggests, like I'm trying to test my feelings. I'm trying to sort of make a test or to try to figure out how do I feel. In a way, I'm interrogating myself, like how do I feel about X, whatever X is. And so if I'm writing about sort of my childhood or my relationship to my parents when I was growing up or whatever, then I'm trying to figure out, well, why did it happen that way, and what did it mean, and how has what happened then had an impact on the kind of person I became or whatever it might be. I think I have more perspective, and I have had plenty of time usually to sort of let things filter through and to really realize, well, things I thought were important later turned out to be not important at all, and to have that kind of perspective. When I'm writing about my children, it's the same kind of impulse to figure out, like, how do I feel about, or how do I think about this particular thing, but it's much more immediate and in the moment, generally speaking. Like, it's something that's going on right now. It's an issue that I'm being faced with, whether it's an issue with, like, identity or gender or, kids and drugs, or, it's a sort of more, it's one of the kind of typical questions that any parent is going to be wrestling with at various stages of their kids' childhood and adolescence. And it can be helpful to me because it's very easy to be, first of all, the easiest thing in the world as a parent is to be reactive, right? Is just to react without really stopping to interrogate yourself at all. Like, that feels bad, stop doing it. Don't put your tongue in there. Or whatever it might be. Like, and a lot of those reactions, you can trust them. If you see your toddler heading towards an electrical socket with a metal key in his hand, your reaction is probably a safe one to go with. But a lot of the reactions you tend to have that are sort of fear-based reactions, fear-based responses, anxiety-based responses, particularly as your kids get older, are not necessarily correct or the most productive or the most useful kind of reactions. But it can be really hard when you're sort of on the ground parenting, when you're at ground level, to stop and interrogate yourself and think, well, why do I think that's a bad thing, or why am I pushing my kid in this direction or that direction? Maybe it turns out you're right, you have the right impulse, but you just didn't really know. A lot of times it turns out I'm wrong. I don't really have a good basis either. I'm carrying over some baggage from my own childhood that is totally irrelevant to this situation, or things have changed in the world of children, and I just don't understand what it's like, to want to constantly be checking Snapchat or whatever it might be. Like, I just, and so to write essays like that are reflecting on things I'm going through right now or have recently gone through is a tool for me, and I'm often grateful that I have this sort of venue and the ability to write about these things, because it does help clarify my thinking. And I've written things, and the same's happened with my wife, Ayelet Waldman, who's also a writer. I've written things about a situation we're jointly facing as parents, and it's only once she's read what I've written that she's like, okay, I see where you're coming from, or I get it, I see more to the question. And I've had the same experience reading her parenting-related pieces. So it has been, in addition to the fact that I hope other people will enjoy reading them, and maybe I could even get paid But it is also maybe first and foremost a tool for me to help just clarify my thinking about whatever it is I'm trying to think about. And that's not just with these essays, that's true with all the essays I write, whatever they're about.
And the kids at this point, at least some of them are old enough. I mean, you're not saying hold that thought. I'm gonna go write an essay and explain it to you. But I guess I'm less.
Hold the key. Stay away from the outlet. I'll be back in 10 minutes to tell you whether you put the key in the outlet.
I'm less interested in the question of whether your kids read your stuff or how you feel about that, and more this idea that being a parent confronts you with all sorts of memory and experience that you carry into parenthood from your own childhood.
Very much so.
And how that gets sort of worked through as far as the relationship you have with your spouse, your partner, but with the kids. I mean, to what extent is it something that you can articulate or they can respond to? And part of the answer to that question is, well, they get to a certain age. But, you know, like, how does that sort of work?
Well, I mean, all you have is your child. When you're confronted with your children's incipient childhood, the one they're going to have, or as they're going through it and they are having it, all you have to draw on, especially at the beginning with your first kid, is your own childhood. That's all you know about childhood. And maybe if you had siblings then and they had a sort of different experience of childhood and you're close enough to them and you know their story, maybe you can call in your brother's experience. But so it's natural, and I think it's usually, or let's say it's often helpful to draw on your own memories of first day of school or how scared you were of getting shots when you were a kid. And so, like, if your kid seems a little nervous about going to the doctor to get a shot, you call on your own memories of how scared you were. Like, that's okay, that's natural and inevitable and useful and helpful, but it can also be completely irrelevant. Your childhood can be utterly irrelevant to your child's childhood, and it's very hard to come to terms with that. And it's very hard to notice that and to realize it, and to realize that, you know, that realization that your child is not you or your partner, and their way of going through the world is distinct to them. Right. And yes, you have things you can call to mind, and there are some universals that any of us could remember, but a lot of what I learned from my childhood turned out to be utterly irrelevant to my children's childhoods. And, you know, I mean, I was so ready to be the father to a lonely nerd who had no friends. Like, I would have been the best dad to the lonely nerd who has no friends of any dad in the history of fatherhood. And I have 4 kids, I didn't get one of those, not one. Like, so, you know, so then if I have a kid who's like socially adept, I have a few kids, all of them really to one degree or another are socially adept, make friends easily, drop them in a new school, new class, on a vacation if there's kids around, no time they're running around with the other kids. Like, and that's in those kind of situations where it's like, what do I do when I have 5 best friends and 2 of them are jealous of the other 3, and, you know, or whatever it is, that, like, I can't help you. Like, I do not know what that feels like. So, you know, it's not, and then of course times have changed, and, you know, and of course this phenomenon I'm talking about is what produces the, you know, the old fogey Alter Cocker mode of discourse, which all parents sooner or later just helplessly fall into, where you're saying things like, well, when I was a kid, you know, we only had 3 channels, right? Like, they're complaining because Cartoon Network, you know, stops showing their favorite show at 2 o'clock in the morning or whatever it is. And you're like, there was no TV at 2 o'clock in the morning. When I was a kid, it was just snow, right? National anthem and then snow. You know, you're telling them things like that. Oh, well, when I was a kid, you know, we would just be bored. So, you know, technology changes, culture changes, mores change, things that are considered socially acceptable or desirable for boys or girls or whatever it is, all that kind of stuff changes. And so you kind of have to learn it all over again.
Yeah.
I mean, like I said, there is material there for you to call on, some universals, like nobody likes getting shots. But it turns out to be not a whole lot of guaranteed experience to bring to bear.
This book opens, the introduction, you have this encounter with a great writer who says, don't have kids. Mm-hmm. If you have kids, you won't write books. Or for every kid that you have, it's one less that you'll end up writing.
Mm-hmm. There's a book for every kid.
Yeah.
That's what I was told.
And you only got that advice once, right? That wasn't something that you encountered as a fledgling writer over and again.
No, I mean, I've heard writers with children, and particularly women writers with children, talk about the difficulty of, the difficulty that getting your work done presents when you've got kids. But nobody else has ever just made up sort of, by fiat, like just has told me, this is it, this is the secret. If you don't do this, you will never become a great writer.
One of the reasons I ask is because I'm curious, in your experience, if you were a published and successful writer before you were a parent, and when did the idea of...
when did I realize just how much destruction and harm had been caused to my work?
No.
Oh, okay. It was when my kid was about 3 months old, but don't draw any conclusions.
All right. Well, Michael doesn't know this. He's coming over to the apartment tonight. He's going to do the night shift.
I'll help you out. I'm good at that.
No, but when did you feel like, you wanted to be a parent? How did that crystallize for you?
Well, I mean, I've always envisioned having children. And in fact, I used to envision long before when I was still a kid, having 4 children, which is what we have.
Really?
Yeah.
How did that?
I had a family of my best friend when I was a kid, 4th, 5th grade in that area, had 3 siblings. And they were all very clustered very closely in age, and I just used to love going over to their house, and there was always something happening there. There was always this kind of collective activity. Everyone was into Norse mythology, and then 3 weeks later, everyone's into Planet of the Apes or whatever it is. And I just, I was 5 and a half when my brother was born. So I was an only child for 5.5 years, and then my brother came along, and I know he was a little very uninteresting small human who couldn't do anything for many years thereafter. So, it wasn't really until my brother was like 4 or 5 years old, right, that you can actually, if you're a kid, find a way to have fun with, a little kid who's like, let's play make-believe. And by that time, I'm 10 and a half, 11 years old. So, my house there wasn't usually that much going on unless it was in my own mind or in my own head, or if I was drawing something or making something. But to go there and just be immersed into this sort of fruitful chaos, I just loved it so much. So I always thought, well, maybe someday I'll have 4 kids. My wife, Ayelet, very rashly at some point, maybe after we'd had 2, said, if you ever win the Pulitzer Prize, we can have 4 children. Because she knew that this was like a thing I had as a dream. So I, very deliberately went about writing a novel that I was certain would win the Pulitzer Prize, and I forced her to, keep to her word, and so we did.
Is that true?
Well, not that last one, but yes, she did say that. When we met and we got engaged and we were going to marry, it was always part of the plan to have kids. She wanted to have kids, I wanted to have kids. How did we decide to just do it when we did it? What happened was we went out to dinner with some friends. We'd been married for about just a few months, a couple months at this point, and we went out to dinner with some friends, and they'd only been married for maybe 3 or 4 years at this point, but they were very unhappily married, and are to this day. And
how many kids do they have?
They have 2, and
has he or she won the Pulitzer Prize?
None of them has won the Pulitzer Prize. I'm happy to report, but they seem so unhappy together It was like the, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf kind of scene. And we were so happy, right? And we felt so smug. And we like went home that night and we were like, we are so great. We are the kind of people who should have a baby. Let's go ahead and do it. And so there are ways as you've discovered, there are ways you can sort of try to ensure that might happen, or things to avoid doing and things you have to do to make that happen. And we avoided and we did those things. And like then the next morning we both woke up and we were like, oh my God, like how much did we drink? Like what did we do? Like, phew. Thankfully no one ever gets pregnant the first time they try, but we did. And that's how we got pregnant with our first kid. And it was immediately apparent to me, like our oldest was not yet a year old, and I had started working on what became The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. And thank you. And I was having a really hard time, like getting where I was not sleeping. I was waking up. I work at night, so in that sense, it was convenient. It worked well for that. Any middle of the night wake ups with all our kids, I would always be responsible for feeding a baby for those, but because I was awake anyway. But still, like, I wanted to be with the kid, and it was hard. I was really having a hard time, and I was complaining to Mona Simpson, who was a friend of ours and lived in LA at the time when she still does, and we lived in LA. And I was saying, I didn't expect this, but I'm having a really hard time, in spite of the warning I received from that famous writer all those years ago. And she said, well, I know this most incredible place. You have to go there. It's called the McDowell Colony. And, if you go there, you can't bring your child with you. So you will get work done. And I applied to the McDowell Colony, and I went, and now, all these years later, I'm actually the chairman of the board of the McDowell Colony. But so it was all because I was trying to escape from my child. And, it's just, like, you can get your work done when you have kids. Obviously, it can be done. It has been done. And many writers have written brilliant books while simultaneously burdened with children. But what I find that you can't do with children, especially when they're little, what children make impossible is in a sense an intensified version of what just everyday life makes impossible about getting your work done, which is children don't care if you get your work done or not. In some ways, they don't really want you to get your work done. And that mirrors, in a sort of local, intense, personal way, what the attitude of the world at large. The world doesn't care if you get your work done either. And the world keeps throwing all these things at you to distract you, and the greatest of which the world has yet to devise is the internet. And, the thing with children is they force you to be always on the surface of life. Like, their problems are all right here, right in your face. They're sick, or they're crying, or they're upset, or they need this, or they want that, or so that when you drop out of your work mind, and even if you have a nice writing schedule, you get your hours in, you get your page count, or your word count, or whatever it is, and your work has gone fine, as soon as you exit the chamber of work and you're back into the child world, the switch gets switched and you can't think about your work anymore. You're forced onto this problem solving, who's going to make dinner, who did the shopping, all that kind of stuff. And so what that means is you're not working when you're not working. And that turned out to be a big blow. Like, before I had kids, I would do my work and then maybe pick up the newspaper, not be working anymore, and I would read this article and think, oh my God, I have to go back. Like, this thing in this newspaper article, this guy's name, or a man-eating Gila monster, or whatever it is, like, that's just what I need for that scene. Or you're walking down the street. I mean, I have this example I give of amazing kind of serendipity in work where I was working on The Mysteries of Pittsburgh, and I had come to this scene, one of the most important scenes in that book is this first love scene between the characters of Art and Arthur. And Art is the narrator, and he's had sex with women before, but when it comes to having sex with a man, he's a virgin in that sense, and he's never done it before. And I got right up to the edge of that scene, and I had a lot of reason for being apprehensive. I wanted to do it right, and I had never written a scene like that before, so I was a little bit, I could sort of see my way into it, but I couldn't see my way out of it, and so finally I got frustrated, and I went for a walk. I was living in Newport Beach at the time. I was walking down the not boardwalk, but cement boardwalk they have there along the ocean, and I just let my mind go, and I was looking at stuff and noticing things, and all of a sudden I see this guy like walking toward me, and he has his head tilted back, and he's holding something. I realize he's got a bloody nose, right? And he's bleeding into a napkin or a paper towel, and there's blood on his face, and I just, like, boom, that's it. Like, I ran back to my house, and that scene ends with the one character like bumping his nose against the other one's head and starting to bleed, and then the sheets get bloody, and then the one who's not the virgin in that situation sort of hangs the sheet out the window, like in primitive cultures where the loss of virginity is advertised in that way. And like that was all not just because I went for the walk, but because when I went for the walk, I didn't have to blow anybody's nose or wipe anybody's butt or make dinner for anybody or anything like that. So that even though I wasn't working anymore, I was still in that fertile state of mind where anything can become incorporated into your work, and that just does not happen, for me at least, when there are kids around. And that's why a place like the MacDowell Colony, for example, is such a great thing, because that's if I go there, if I go away and I have no responsibilities and burdens on my time, then I can get into that state where just a chance comment by a stranger can suddenly solve a whole problem in what I'm working on, even though I stopped writing 15 hours ago.
In the intro, you, after getting this sage advice, you say to him, you don't say to him, you say to us, you knew what kind of dad you were going to be. You were going to be a very present father. You were going to be there, and I don't remember the list of things, but after school and
swimming
lessons and all of that. I'm curious to hear you talk about, I know it has a book called Bad Mother, and what in the very brief period of time that I've been a dad, what I've acknowledged, people have said all along, is that the dad takes the kid to the grocery store and is a hero.
Right.
Maybe does it sort of once out of the 10 times or so. I mean, you're a very good dad. And what do you notice about?
You're totally right. It's ridiculous. The standard for being a good dad is so low.
Well, that's my point.
Yeah, and I mean it's higher than it used to be, but that is saying so little.
Right.
And you're right. You can just get. I mean, you're a good dad if you're still around.
Right.
You're a good dad if you financially provide for your children and you don't leave. You're already like 2/3 of the way there.
So you knew what kind of dad you wanted to be.
Well, I thought I did.
From what model? Because maybe your dad wasn't.
My dad was a very typical father of his time, when the standard, like I say, was even lower than it is now, and he met that standard very well. And I think he did the best he could. It wasn't enough for me. I mean, that's a thing that you learn very quickly about children, is like no matter how much love you give them, no matter how much time you lavish on them, it's never enough. And they'll take more. And they'll just take more and more and more, and you play with them for 3 hours straight till you're bored out of your skull and you never want to see another little Polly Pocket for the rest of your life. And when you say, okay, I'm done, like they'll be sad, they'll cry, they'll want more. So what I got, in terms of fathering, I definitely would have liked to have had more, but I think it was less about the quantity or the amount or the degree for me than it was my having a realization very young, while watching Marlo Thomas's Free to Be You and Me and listening to the record album from that show that was on constant rotation in my house in 1973, 74. There's this one number in that show and on the album called William's Doll, which is based on a children's book by Charlotte Zolotow, and it's about this boy named William who wants a doll. And this is a very 1970s thing for a boy to want. And I remember there was an episode of All in the Family where once Mike and Gloria had a baby and they wanted to get him a doll, and Archie was mad about that. It was like a very sort of 70s topic. And it was definitely one that had penetrated into my world, and I was aware they were starting to sell like dolls for boys and things like that. But what struck me about William in this story and song was the reason he wanted the doll was because he wanted to learn how to take care of it. Like he wanted to learn how to change his diaper and burp it and all of the things that in my experience, in my world, and everything I had ever seen were the mother's jobs. And it was just presented, I don't know, it was presented in a way that it was very persuasive to me. And I just thought, okay, because I liked kids already, I liked babies, and it was just very good for me to have it shown to me that this was a role that was open and available if you wanted it. And I don't think it had ever been presented that way to any boy ever up until, this Free to Be You and Me, and that book by Charlotte Zalto. So, from that moment on, I just had this idea of like, when I'm a dad, I will do all the mom things.
Yeah.
The things that are the things I saw my mom doing with my little brother. That's going to be, I want to do that. I want to do it too, not just out of some desire for parody or to make her life easier or whatever it is, but just because it actually looks interesting and fun and rewarding. And it turned out to be rewarding.
Was your dad somebody who had an adverse reaction to seeing you parent in that way?
No, my dad, no, not at all. My mom, she didn't have an adverse reaction, but I think it was just not at all. She had nothing like it, but she had more like a jaw-dropping reaction of like, wow, you're changing many diapers. Like, I don't think I ever saw your father change. And my dad's a pediatrician, right? Like, my dad could, change a child's, respiratory system. But, my dad never changed a diaper. And so the reaction I got from my mom was just more like, wow, things have really changed. Yeah. Like, I never thought I would see something like this, which is really weird. When we had our first kid, 23 years ago, there were no changing tables in men's rooms in the airport.
Right.
And which is disgusting. And then I had to do it on the floor.
Yeah.
In the stall. Ew. And by the time they finally started putting changing tables in men's rooms universally, it was almost too late. But I did get to take advantage of it right at the tail end.
I'm noticing this as well, and they do a better job now. But there are a lot of places where the men's room doesn't.
Ew.
And I don't think, if I said to my wife there's no changing table in the men's room, she would take the baby into the women's room, which isn't fair to her, but
she's not around.
Right, we would go home. We would.
That's it. No, and it's also like if you're a woman, a mom, you take your child regardless of gender into the women's room with you, right? No big deal. My grandmother, I can remember to this day her taking me into the women's room at Garfinkel's department store at Washington, D.C. To play with the parakeets in the cage. So, but when you're a man and you have a daughter, you don't want to take her into the men's room. You kind of have to. You have no choice. And now I see dads doing it, and I always feel like really, my heart goes out to you because you feel like I don't like going into men's rooms myself, So, but there's a weird, there's not a perfect symmetry still, far from it. Yeah. And I can remember being with our oldest when she was about 4 in Mexico, in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. And we went to the Central Market in the heart of town, and there's just the two of us, she and I, and it's hot, and there's a big, noisy, crowded market in Mexico, and she said she had to use a bathroom. And I'm like, oh my God, what do I do? I can't take her into I don't know if they do that in Mexico, if they take girls into the men's room, and I'm sort of standing there paralyzed with doubt, and she's like, Dad, I'm just gonna go into the ladies' room. I can do it myself. And I thought, can you? I've never sent you into a bathroom alone by yourself in a public place before. And it's I don't think I have any choice. Okay, honey, go ahead, go in. I'll be waiting right here. And she just stands there, and I'm like, go on, it's okay. And she said, no, Dad, I need a peso for the lady. And that was a moment for me with her where I was like, oh, you actually have way more on the ball than I do.
Right. Should we open it to the audience?
Sure, I'm happy to.
Bring up the lights.
Oh my gosh.
Raise your hands, please. Don't be shy. Yep. Please speak up.
How do you contrast your father-daughter relationship with your father-son relationships?
Well, I would say generally speaking, like I already said, my own sort of childhood experience turned out to not equip me very well for any of my children's childhoods. Not as well as I had thought it would. But in many, what turn out to be key respects of guiding children through their childhoods, my total lack of experience in dealing with some of the things that girls have to deal with growing up proved to be a handicap, like routinely a handicap in a way that wasn't the case with my son. So like dealing with the interpersonal dynamics of girls. I had always observed those things very much from a distance as a kid. And all of my instincts were sort of honed in combat as a boy, like trying to grow up, among boys as a boy. So like when one of my daughters would come home from elementary school and be in some very complicated interpersonal drama with 5 little girls, and 2 of them are being mean to a third who was being mean to another one this other time. And I would have my advice would be things like, why didn't you just tell her to shut up? Right? Or something like that. Like, just don't sit next to them or whatever it is. Like things that kind of might have worked when I was a boy in a boy social dynamic just didn't seem like I would think, well, this is probably a similar kind of situation. Here's my advice. And they would, both of them, just look at me like, oh my God, you have no idea. Like that is the dumbest thing an adult has ever said. This is all just in their eyes. I mean, they're not saying these words to me, but I would just be like, okay, I guess that wasn't very helpful. In my experience, I discovered a lot of my sort of shortcomings and insensitivities, and you can go through boyhood very easily and well into manhood without having a whole lot of sensitivity to feelings of other people. Many men have proved that many times, and it's okay. You can make it, and especially when you're in a world of preteen boys, 11, 12, 13-year-old boys, where it's just basically the discourse consists entirely of put downs and insults and mockery, and that's how you show affection, and that's how you show everything. That dynamic that I was sort of both tormented by and participated in just didn't seem to be occurring in a way with the girls when they were that age where I was of any use to them whatsoever. So it just wasn't like that. It wasn't playing out in that same way. There's a lot more of sort of pretending to be sympathetic when you actually aren't, and when you're talking smack about somebody behind their back, like things I just had never really had to contend with. So, but I didn't allow myself to just give up. I just decided, it really bothers me. I don't believe in those kind of gender differences, on principle. Maybe they exist and maybe they don't, but I'm going to behave as if they don't, because I think ultimately those differences tend to fall away over time. And I don't want to be told if your hair needs to be braided, go to mom, because mom knows how to braid hair. I'm just gonna, okay, I was the worst hair braider in the whole world, but I didn't stay there. I forced myself to learn. I just did it over and over, and they would very sort of tolerantly indulge me with these horrible, I'd be like, I think I got it, honey, and there'd just be this whole plate just totally falling out, and they'd be like, no, it's okay, Dad, but I wouldn't give in. I didn't want to be stuck in my role as this dopey, inept dad who can't braid his daughter's hair, and I didn't want them to think that was a fact of biology or something like that. So I just stuck with it, and then like eventually, like I could never do a French braid, but at least I could braid my daughter's hair evenly and make an attractive, presentable braid. So like I think the important thing is that I learned like the difference like between fathering sons and fathering daughters is you are carrying all this baggage. You're carrying your own personal baggage. You're carrying social baggage, cultural baggage, about like thousands of years of history of gender differences and maybe biological differences as well. And I just felt like I'm not ever going to give in to any of that. Like I'm just going to fight it in every way I can and try to, if there is some sort of shortfall in me because I don't have experience with the things that the females in my life are going through, I'm going to just hang in there till I try to overcome that shortfall, figure it out, get the hang of it, watch how my wife handles it, watch the kinds of things she says when she's trying to validate their whatever they're going through. She's trying to sort of show that she gets how painful or hurtful it might be. I'll watch that and I'll copy it next time and I'll see if it works.
Thank you.
Sure.
Will you braid my hair?
If you have about 25 minutes.
All the way in the back on the aisle. Yeah.
I'm actually a stay-at-home father.
Yes.
So I really feel all the stuff that.
Yeah.
And I'm a member of the New York City Dads Group, which is about bringing fatherhood together, changing the dynamic, and all this stuff. Anyway, my question has nothing to do with that. I also battle depression, and I was wondering if you ever reached a point with any of your kids where you just couldn't take anymore.
Yeah. Had to kind of step back.
Yeah, and you just lost. Like, you're sitting there, you know you love them, but you are not feeling it.
I mean, yes, definitely, especially when they're young and their verbal skills aren't really there yet, or you get into these guessing games of trying to figure out what the problem really is, or we had one child who was colicky, just unbearable, 6 to 8 or 9 p.m. every single night for months, fussiness, crying, whatever, where it's just, you do feel like, I felt like I was at the limits of my tolerance or my ability. And there have been moments, it's not, for me, what I've struggled with most, I think, is impatience with like trying to find shortcuts, to sort of short circuit a situation that can't be short-circuited. And because I don't have the patience or the energy or the strength to do what I think, at this point, experience has told me is probably going to be like 3 hours of parenting work, of like amateur psychology to try to get through this. And I'll just like, buck up is like nothing I would ever say, but it's that feeling you have of like, stop, enough already, you'll be fine. When I was a kid, blah, 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 whatever it is. So, the temptation, and you feel like you have this wise adult perspective. Like, so you see your child suffering in some way from something that you know perfectly well is actually meaningless, right? Or will mean nothing to them tomorrow or 3 years from now. You see them being tormented by peers in the 8th grade who are their best friends in the world, and the people whose opinions mean the most to them, and you want to say, like, I do not even remember the names of the people I was in 8th grade with, right? Like, someday a day is going to come when you are so far past all of this, this is going to be utterly meaningless to you. Like, it's hard to resist saying things like that or acting on feelings like that where you feel like your kid is just so misguided in caring about the things they care about. Or you know that this seems like a big deal right now, but is not going to be a big deal. And that's fine to think all those things and know all those things, but it's the times when I lose that patience, when I just want to take a shortcut and say, you know what, your friends are all idiots, and 10 years from now, you're not going to give a shit about any of them. So go away and leave me alone. Like that impulse is like the thing I experience sometimes, not on a daily basis anymore, but still all the time. Where your own adult perspective, again, is kind of useless in some ways.
Over here.
So fatherhood and family kind of flow through Manhood for Amateurs and Moonglow. I'm wondering if writing those books informed putting these essays together, if at all there's a kind of inheritance that you can trace across those books.
Well, I mean, I definitely see, like, I think some of the pieces, any of the pieces in this book could have easily have been in Manhood for Amateurs, had I written them at the time. I definitely think there's a continuum there, although these are much more narrowly focused on fatherhood, whereas the essays in that book range more widely across various aspects of being a man. But yeah, I mean, I think more than anything else, and this is an argument I didn't know well enough, or I had no idea of when I was given that advice all those years ago not to have children, is that having children, if nothing else, it destroys a lot of your time and interferes horribly with your work and prevents you from doing things you want to be able to do creatively, but it also gives you material. And, I've been able to, even without directly writing about one of my actual kids in any way, even in fiction, in a fictional context, having children has provided me with material for my work, for my fiction, and I wouldn't have had that material if I hadn't had children. So that is some kind of compensation in some way for that. I mean, and it's, you change teams once you have kids, so that, I wrote about fathers and sons and relationships between parents and children before I had kids in The Mysteries of Pittsburgh, and the stories about Nathan Shapiro and his family going through divorce, but I always wrote from the point of view of the kid. And in the few times when I wrote from a point of view of a parent, it was in a very glancing way. Probably not because I consciously was thinking, I've never been a parent, so I don't know how to write from a parent's point of view. It just maybe didn't feel natural or possible even in some way. It didn't occur to me to do it. And once I had children, it's like, once you have children, before you have children and you read Romeo and Juliet, you're like, stupid Montagues and Capulets, like if they had just gotten out of those kids' way, they loved each other, all they wanted to do was be together, and if they had just been left alone, everything would have been fine. And then you have children, and you're like those idiot kids. Like their parents warned them. Like if they had just listened to their parents, none of this would have happened. And that was a weird realization for me, like reading Romeo and Juliet and finding myself like, these kids this is crazy. They're like children. They can't be having sex and getting married and deciding to live together. Like their parents knew better. And something like that happened to me as a writer too, where I finally was able to allow parents from a parent's point of view into my work, and that just, in a sense, almost doubled my source material that I could draw on. So on the whole, I don't regret it, I would say, today.
Maybe two more, and then we'll sign books. In the back. You, sir.
You mentioned for the title essay of this book that you focused on that memory of your dad with the house call visits, and you were looking to make that part of this collection. I'm wondering if there are ever any moments where you have that sort of image, whether or not it happened in your past, that you want to explore in writing, and are you always certain if you want it to be nonfiction, or is that sort of exploring that thing you want to write about ever fluid and could become fiction, or is it always separated for you?
Generally speaking, if I have a specific episode like that, or sort of a constellation of episodes like the visits, the house calls I made with my dad when I was a kid, if I have that, if that's where I'm starting from, generally speaking, that might be more likely to work its way, to become nonfiction, I would think. Whereas, because when I'm generally, again, when I'm starting a work of fiction, I don't usually start with a particular incident or episode. I'm usually starting with a milieu, with a world, how I think of it as a world. So like with Cavalier and Clay, like I wanted to write about New York in the 1940s, 30s and 40s, and that desire preceded even the comic book side of it. But the comic book side presented itself very quickly as like a vehicle to get into that time and place, and then, I started thinking, well, given the setting, given the time period, given now this, I know what the sort of trade is in this book, who are my characters likely to have been? Well, most of the early pioneers were young Jewish guys from New York. Not all of them, but most of them. So probably my main characters are going to fit that description. Like, once I have the milieu, then all the other things start to fill in, and then comes time to start telling the story. At that point, even in a period piece written about a time in which I wasn't alive, I still might draw on things that happened to me, remembered episodes. Like when I was working on the section in Cavalier and Clay where they have that one weekend to get a whole comic book together, and they all sort of stay up in a frenzy, and all these dudes are lying around in bathtubs and sprawled everywhere. I had never been in that situation, but I was in a band in college, right? And I remember this sort of, that feeling of both lassitude and energy, and being with a bunch of guys and trying to get something done, and having it all come into focus and then fall out of focus again. So I drew on personal experience, but it was, in a way like method acting, where I'm calling on my own experience to help me figure out what my characters are feeling and thinking. But there's exceptions to that, because like with Moonglow, I started writing about this actual incident that didn't happen to me, but that story I had been told about my grandfather's brother being fired from his job to make room on the payroll for Alger Hiss when Alger Hiss got out of prison. And so I did start with an incident, but it didn't become an essay, it became a novel. So it's not a hard and fast rule, but usually I draw on my own experience to try to fill in a fictional framework that I've already decided on.
One more. Yes, here.
You mentioned your grandmother taking to Garfinkel's.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could say a bit more about your relationship with your grandparents and also your parents as grandparents.
Well, my grandparents I grew up primarily in Columbia, Maryland, and my mother's parents lived in Silver Spring, Maryland, and my father's parents lived in Northern Virginia, in Washington, D.C., and then in Northern Virginia. So they were all around when I was a kid. And I had important relationships, and they were a big presence to one degree or another in my life. My father's mother, in particular, was a very curious woman, and with a lot of strange. She must have had some form of OCD. I realized in hindsight, we didn't call it that, and we just made fun of her, actually, to be honest, for doing things like washing all the dishes in soap and water and then wrapping each plate individually in saran wrap before putting it into her cabinet, or carrying a little spray bottle of Lysol around in her handbag that she would spray on bus seats and park benches before she would let me sit down on them. And when she would take me into the men's room or the women's room at Garfinkel's, she would send me into the stall to do what I had to do. But then when I was done, I was not allowed to touch anything. I had to stand up and call for her. And then she would come in and, like, with her little tiny, she was like 4'9", to just kick the flush handle with her pointy shoe. I subsequently called it the Minsk kick. So that, she wouldn't, but she was she came through the New York public school system in the early decades of the 20th century, and as part of that legacy for her was she had been obliged to learn poetry by heart. So she would recite poetry from memory to me, like Longfellow and William Cullen Bryant, and like those poets nobody reads anymore. I heard a lot of poetry coming out of her mouth. And that made a strong impression on me. And then my mother's parents, my mother's father, especially after my parents divorced and my dad moved away, he became like primary father figure in my life. And he was, we saw them every weekend. And he had a very strong influence and an impact on me. And he loved literature, and he loved jokes, and he loved making things with his hands, and he was really interested in science and technology, and he passed all those things on to me. So, those are very productive, important relationships for me, especially those two. My father's father died when I was about 11, and he was a very quiet, he was from the quiet school of Jewish men. Like that classic joke, the one about the kid who comes home from school, and he says, this boy comes home from Hebrew school. He's like, Mommy, I got cast in a Hebrew school play. And she says, that's wonderful, honey. What part did you get? And he says, I'm going to play the Jewish husband. And she says, you march right back there and make them give you a speaking role. That was my dad's dad. But we used to listen to baseball games on the radio, and that's how he liked to pass a Sunday afternoon. And that I love listening to baseball on the radio to this day because of the memories of that. So they all had an impact on me in one way or another. The only one who survived into my my mother's parents survived till I was in my early mid-20s, and they all went too soon, and much too soon for me to have actually found out as much about them as I would have liked to have known. And in fact, that was sort of the motivation for writing Moonglow, ultimately, where I invented grandparents, because I could know my invented grandparents so much better than I had ever been able to know my actual grandparents. So, did that answer the question?
The second part was, how are your parents as grandparents?
Unfortunately, my wife's parents, who are here tonight, and are wonderful grandparents, but they live in New Jersey, very far away from Berkeley, California, so we don't get to see them anywhere near as often as we would like to. My father lives in Portland, Oregon, which is a little closer, but still you have to get an airplane to go there. And my mom lives nearby. I do I feel like my children missed out on that proximity. That the fact that all my grandparents lived so close to us and we saw them all the time. Even though, like as a kid, a lot of times the last thing I wanted to do was schlep out to Four Corners, Seven Corners, Virginia, and see, my grandparents when I could have been doing something fun. But, in hindsight, when I look back on it, I wish there had been more times like that. So, that's how it is nowadays. Families are scattered. I don't know what we're gonna do when we have grandchildren. I don't know. We'll just move in.
What do your kids think about having kids?
Having us move in with them?
Well,
They're
no.
not for it.
But you said as a kid you wanted 4 children. You have 4 children. Are they looking to have big families of their own?
I don't know. They talk about it sometimes, and sometimes they say things like, I'm not having any children. But I don't believe them.
Do you tell them that you don't believe
Yes,
them?
I do tell them that. I say, I don't believe you. I don't know. I think it's, just looking in from the outside, I think it's pretty cool to be from a family of 4 kids or more. When people come from larger families. I'm very close to my brother, but there are just 2 of us, and we have a 2-person kind of dynamic. But when there's 4 of you, these people now, especially, they take up a lot of space. They're just walking down the sidewalk. There's no room for you. Like, they are this thing. They're this entity. There's 4 of them. When we were walking through, we were in Japan at December, and admittedly, there aren't that many families of 4 in Japan at all, and then these are like 4 somewhat eccentric-looking young, Americans walking down the street. But there was just some sense of it was almost like a weird parade float was passing by. People would just be like, "Whoa, are they all siblings?" And they have this sort of mass identity in a way that I can't even really quite begin to imagine I can only imagine, but I can't really get a sense of what that would be like.
I have a friend, she has 3 kids, and she says the children must outnumber the parents. That's her rule.
Must?
Yes.
That's probably better for the children,
Yeah.
I think, if they do.
Should we sign some books?
Sure.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.